Leon, you can. Perfect. Great. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us for this online interfaith forum on the topical theme of religion, democracy, and elections. Just before we begin, if I can please ask everyone to check that you're on mute and to keep yourself muted throughout the meeting unless you have been asked to speak in the case of panelists. So this is just to prevent any background interference that might affect the sound quality. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this forum. My name is Ryan Commins. I'll be chairing and moderating our discussion today. We're also joined by 4 panelists whom I will be introducing in due course. And it's wonderful to have so many of you joining us in this meeting, which is also being recorded so that we can make it available to some people who are not able to attend it live. I'd like to extend a special welcome to those of you who are new to this series of online interfaith forums, as well as to old friends. These events began as a grassroots interfaith peace-building project 6 years ago in the city of Leicester, back in July 2018. At that time, it was graciously hosted in and supported by the Leicester Community of Christ congregation. But during the pandemic, we moved online, which has enabled us to broaden our reach and to involve a much wider range of participants and panelists. So it's good to be joined this evening by familiar faces, people from the online community connections group, as well as interfaith dialogue partners from previous forums. But it's also wonderful to have many new people joining us for this timely and topical discussion. So 2024 is an election year across the world. I was looking it up earlier today, almost 100 countries, home to nearly half the world's population, either have voted or will be voting this year. And since most of our audience is based in the UK and we have an election within the next 2 weeks, I just want to remind people that you do now require photo ID in order to vote. And if you don't have photo ID, you can apply on the government website for a voter authority certificate. And the deadline for this is 5 p.m. on the coming Wednesday, the 26th of June. I'll try to put a link to that in the chat. The aim of today's discussion, as always, is to work towards 3 main outcomes. So firstly, I hope that we'll leave with a better and deeper understanding of some of the faith communities, religious traditions, and non-religious worldviews that exist in our country, and in countries, I should say, plural. I also hope it will be an opportunity to practice the difficult but increasingly important skill of disagreeing without being disagreeable. And finally, I hope that some of these conversations will continue after the meeting ends and that people might be able to find scope for coexistence, respect, and possibly even new friendships across religious divides. So I'll just briefly explain the format of the discussion, how it's going to work, and then we'll get stuck in. So in a moment, each of our panelists will give their response to a specific prompt question, which is religion a help or a hindrance to a healthy democracy? After the first panelist has spoken, I might ask them a follow-up question to draw out or build on something they've said, and then we'll move on to our next panelist. While the panelists are speaking, I'd like to invite all of you, whether you're an audience member or another panelist, to type any questions or comments that you might have into the chat box. You can either address your questions and comments to me directly in a private message, so that's Ryan Commins, or you can simply type your thoughts and questions into the chat box. And once every panelist has spoken, I'll pick up some of these questions and comments, and I'll give the panelists a chance to respond. If I could please ask everyone to keep questions and answers as short as possible so that everyone has a chance to speak and to share their thoughts and questions. And then finally, at the end of the discussion, each panelist will have a brief opportunity to give some closing thoughts and some reflections. So without any further ado, we will begin with Jessica Metheringham from Reading Quaker Meeting. Jessica is a board game designer, a political consultant, and a Quaker. She has worked in Parliament, Whitehall, and with local government. She is currently chair of Unlock Democracy, which calls for a more transparent democracy underpinned by a fairer voting system and a written constitution. And she has previously led political engagement for Quakers in Britain. So, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us. We very much appreciate having you with us on the panel. Is religion a help or a hindrance to a healthy democracy?
Thank you very much. So this is one of those things where, firstly, I'm going to be doing some fence sitting because, this is what Quakers are particularly good at. But that means looking at either side of the fence as well. So I think sometimes with these things, we need to start with what democracy is. So it should be a system in which power is vested in the people, the general population. We know this. When it's a healthy democracy, then obviously there are multiple links between the system and the people, multiple ways in which the general population get to exercise their power and, to state their views, to say what they think. And for many people, faith will be a cornerstone of their views. This will be something that's part of their approach. It's part of their identity. So to disregard this would clearly be to cut out a significant part of the population. However, and there was always going to be a however there, just like something like a healthy diet, then clearly you require balance. Too much focus placed on religion, specifically one religion, rather than faith in general, can clearly throw the balance off. So suppose that we said that faith was a hindrance, that you can't talk about it in political debates. That would mean that we would have a whole group of people who don't have the language to express their views because it's spiritual language and they feel as though they have been restricted from this. But if we went the other way, then clearly, so let's suppose we gave the impression that faith was a social necessity for political life. Clearly, we would be stifling a whole nother, different group of people. Maybe even the same group of people. So, this shows that demanding religion would hinder democracy. That's because faith is personal. This is not a political football. But I think the real thing about this would be that sometimes we discuss politics like it is cold, logical decisions, when actually, politics is about messy human lives. It's about human emotions. So I am really not convinced that faith, that moral ethics, that these are things separate from the rest of the lives. Whether we think of it as spiritual, humanism, specific code, some sort of religion, whatever it is, then it's deeply entwined, deeply part of who we are and how we think. So to be sure that democracy is healthy, we need to bring our whole selves, which is the messy human complexity and all, which means, of course, that so that brings it back to the fact that religion would neither be help nor hindrance, but it's just a simple fact of people's lives, fact of the general population. So it's part of democracy, whether it likes it or not.
Thank you very much, Jessica. This may be something that we circle back to in our discussion later. But just before we move on, I wanted to ask you, do you think that religious groups should be allowed to lobby political parties? In your view, does that help or hinder democracy?
To the extent to which there is any group which is allowed to lobby, because there should be restrictions upon how people can lobby. I mean, clearly people want to engage in democracy. When you get a group of people together, then it is lobbying, whether it's a big multinational, whether it's a small group. So, I mean, to the extent to which people are allowed to lobby, then I think, yes, religious groups should be allowed to lobby. Now, I think the restrictions upon lobbying should be much more to do with finance and money and not to do with points of principle.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next panelist is Farah Morley. Farah is an author, artist, and designer who has lectured to diverse audiences, including the BBC, the internationally renowned Beyond the Border Festival, the Quest Foundation, the UK government, and at several previous forums, also to us. She's spoken on aspects of spirituality, multiculturalism, education, and the decorative arts. And she lives in Cardiff, in Wales, with her husband and children. So, Farah, thank you so much for joining us again. Is religion a help or a hindrance to a healthy democracy?
I would say, as in most aspects of life, it can be both. It can certainly be the moral compass by which you direct all of your decisions, political or apolitical. But I think what it is an imperative. It's an imperative to see change and make that change be something that you have a hand in. So I would say, from my belief system, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, if you see something which is wrong, hate it in your heart, and this is the least of what you can do. Then speak out against it, and then do something against it. And I think that this is the most powerful way that most people can affect change. And if we don't vote, and if we don't sort of use our moral compass to decide which direction in which to engage in the political forum, I think that in some ways that is also casting a vote, and it's casting a vote for no change. So I think that it has to be an important factor in how we deal with life. And as Jessica said, that there is practically nothing in our lives which is apolitical. Everything has that aspect, from walking down the street to the potholes to homelessness to international politics. You know, every aspect is there as a test for our moral caliber. And the separation of church and state, you know, that can only really occur if we live in separate realms, which we don't, unfortunately. So there is a huge overlap between the two. So seeing as that is the realpolitik of our existence, we must say that, you know, of course, every aspect of what directs us in the secular sense should be the thing that directs us in the political sense. And so I think that it can only be a help if used in the right way. Of course, as you said, with the lobbying and the pressure groups and these things, you know, if you have sort of special interest groups that have disproportionate amounts of power or money, whether they be political, religious, international, whatever, they can certainly, you know, lead us astray. I'm sort of questioning Nigel Farage's whole sort of Ukraine speech, and it makes you wonder, you know, what kind of lobbyists are working on him and where his paymasters are. So, you know, obviously, you know, we can see that it can have effects in every way. And I think as a religious person, we need to be aware of that. We need to be slightly above it. Having said that, even as a humanist, you can be aware of that and be slightly above it. So that would be my answer. I don't know if it's as clear cut, but I would say that it's an impossibility. You know, I think in reality, we cannot separate the two.
Thank you very much, Farah. There's before we move on to our next panelist, I wanted to get your opinion on whether it's legitimate in democracy for a religious group to seek to influence the way that other people live and worship, particularly by political means. So there's a verse in the Quran which is often quoted, particularly by critics of Islam. Says it's in Surah 8, in verse 39, fight them until there is no more mischief and all worship is devoted to God alone. From your perspective as a Muslim, is it legitimate in a democracy for religious believers to seek political influence over the way that people live and worship?
So I think from my religious belief, we have this aspect that after God created consciousness within humans, he gave them free will. And so that principle of no compulsion in belief and the free will to choose, even right from wrong, and wrong from right, has to be there. It's part of the God-given right and the human condition. Now, if you feel so compelled that you have the right methods, then surely your ability to set an example or to show in lots of other ways, rather than corralling people into your ideology, must be the way to go. It always, for me, it always smacks of, it sort of delegitimizes a belief system if you feel you have to compel others to be part of it. The principles should stand for themselves, and they should be self-evident. There shouldn't be any compulsion. And so particularly in a political system where you are dealing with pluralism, so not only are you dealing with not just your own faith group, which you shouldn't compel anyway, but you're dealing with faith groups outside of this and people with no faith. And so absolutely, this has to go against the principles of Islam. With regards to that surah, as many verses in the Torah, the Quran, and actually secular law, when you take things out of context, they can become particularly, painful and particularly dangerous. So you can take aspects of secular law in the statute books and put those aspects where they're not needed or where they're not even relevant, and it can lead to injustice. And I would say that this surah is one of those aspects that when you are absolutely fighting against, in the Second World War, when you were fighting the Nazis, and it was a moral, well, I say the word crusade, but it was a moral obligation to stand up to something which was so abhorrent, then you do fight them till there is no more of that abhorrence self-evident. So I think that's how I would explain that. But I hope that answers the question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Farah. And thank you to people who have left comments and questions in the chat already. I'm looking forward to getting stuck into some of them soon. And as a reminder, you can it's helpful if you can indicate if there is a particular panelist or panelists that your question is directed to. Also, fellow panelists, please also feel free to send my way any thoughts, comments, or questions that you would like to direct to what another panelist has said, or if there's a particular point that you would like to add, and I can bring you into the discussion. Our next panelist is Megan Manson. Megan works for the National Secular Society, which campaigns for a secular democracy where everyone is treated equally, regardless of religion or belief. Megan previously worked for the Japanese government promoting cultural exchange, and she's also the secretary of her local interfaith group. So Megan, thank you so much for being here. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Is religion a help or a hindrance to a healthy democracy?
Thank you very much. So I think I'm going to do a little bit of fence sitting myself. In fact, one thing to acknowledge is that religion is an undeniably powerful social force. It's something that has in common with business, social media, globalization, and many protest movements, which we see day to day in the 21st century. And like any of these powerful forces which exert influence on people, it can be a force for good or for bad. We've seen this throughout history, and we see it today. So many social phenomena have this power to either help or hinder democracy, and religion is no exception. And this is where secularism comes in. The National Secular Society exists to promote the principle of secularism, which simply means separation of religion and state to ensure equality for all, whatever their religion or belief. Secularism is not the same thing as atheism or humanism, which are philosophical worldviews that reject beliefs in deities. Secularism is a political principle which anyone of any religion or philosophical worldview can hold. And the goal of secularism is to make sure religion is not a hindrance to healthy democracy. And the basis of this is the principle that religion and state should be separate. We only need look at some of the least democratic countries in the world to see why mixing religion and state is a recipe for disaster. The least democratic country in the world, according to the 2022 Democracy Index, is Afghanistan, which is a country ruled by Islamist fundamentalists. And it's no surprise that many of the other most theocratic countries in the world, including Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, also make the bottom 20 of the Democracy Index. And in contrast, the USA, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, and most of Europe share in common both high democratic rankings and no state religion. So why is a lack of separation between religion and the state a hindrance to democracy? The first reason is that when the state gives special status to one religion, this inherently favours members of that religion over other citizens. And democracy requires that citizens of all religions and beliefs are equal. So a state religion is incompatible with democracy. A second reason is that lawmaking is at the heart of democracy, but religious laws are not made democratically. In a democracy, laws are mandated by representatives elected by the public. But religious laws are usually set down by an elite group of clerics who claim to represent divine will. The masses don't really get a say in this. And that elite group is often exclusionary of women, ethnic minorities, LGBT people, and of course, those of different religions and beliefs. And as a result, they often impose codes which oppress these groups. And a third reason is that while democracy both facilitates and requires change, religion is largely resistant to change. In many cases, those religious laws are set down in a holy book which cannot be easily altered. In fact, many Orthodox religions outlaw reinterpretation, revision, or even disagreement with their core texts, and the punishment for doing so can be brutal. So to sum up, religion has the potential not just to hinder democracy, but to undermine it entirely. And that's why separation of religion and state is essential to protect our democratic rights and freedoms. And that includes freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion or belief. I myself am quite pro-religion. I'm interested in religion. I'm a member of a religious community myself. I want religion to be its best self in society. And I think secularism is the way to make sure religion is its best self and it helps people rather than hinders democracy.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Our final panelist, and then we will have a chance to explore questions in more detail later. Our final panelist is Lap Blaylock. Lap Blaylock has worshipped in an Anglican church for the last 35 years in Leicester. He is a religious educator, having taught the subject religious education for 12 years and worked as an RE advisor for 30 years. He edited RE Today, which is a professional magazine for religious education teachers, for 20 years until 2023. So Lap, thank you so much for being here. Is religion a help or a hindrance to a healthy democracy?
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation. I love being involved in an open-hearted forum and learning from each other, so I'm looking forward to all of this. My answer to the question is that I think religion can be a force for good in democratic societies, and it's a net positive. And here's why. My political aspirations myself, just to put all the cards on the table, is that I would like to be a democratic Christian socialist. And I'm not an office holder in my church, but I am a preacher there, and I run a group for about 38 to 11-year-old children. I think they need democratic rights as well. I'm interested in the ways in which democracy is available to children and young people. Myself, I'm a Democrat because I'm a Christian. So my Christian vision is that every human counts for one, each of us made in the image of God. I'm not able to make any claim this evening that the Church of England has got a very fine record on democracy. A church that began in part because Henry VIII fancied the pants off Anne Boleyn is not a strong democratic starting. But I value the practical democracy of the Church of England's synods and our PCCs. In England, for example, we have 12,500 parishes. All of them elect their church councils. That involves about 150,000 people in office holding and democratic service. That's one of the biggest democratic expressions in England, and I think that's a success. There's some history, of course, and I'll just give you one little example there. You'll know that 111 years ago, on the 11th of June, at the Epsom Derby, Emily Davidson died under the hooves of the King's horse. She was a martyr to feminism and as a suffragette. And her sacrifice is very widely remembered, but did you know that she described herself always as a militant Anglican, a warrior for democracy, a soldier of Christ? Could be just one example of Anglicans, many other Christians who have given their all for democracy, and I'm always interested in examples like that. As an Anglican Christian worshipper, then my socio-political vision is really shaped and influenced by the worldview that shapes for me. And I like the way that the Lutheran Reformation in Europe asserted New Testament roots to a Christian vision of community where everybody could be, as it were, priests for each other. I like forms of Christian community where leadership structures are flat and anyone and everyone can be a source of insight, or as Christian insiders would say, the power of the Spirit. And I like to ask, in the context of our question this evening, who's the demos? Who are the people in this democracy? And in a nation state, the demos is always religion and belief, plural. Diversity is at the heart of democratic visions, and I'd say we need democracy because of our differences, not because of our similarities. Christians ought to play a part in making space for diversities, and particularly for minorities, I think. I'm an admirer of Friedrich Nietzsche philosophically, but he was especially contemptuous of Christians amongst all religions because we exalt the weak and we attend to the margins and we worship a bloke who was crucified. I'm glad of that, actually. I disagree with Friedrich there. And I think democracies are flawed if majoritarianism marginalizes minorities within democracies. And I think people who want to call themselves Christian Democrats, as I'd like to, they need Jesus's teaching about the space given to the least of our sisters and brothers, a marker for justice in the whole of the political system. End up quoting Reinhold Niebuhr, a brilliant United States Reformed theologian. He says, the human capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but the human inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. And that, for me, is why Churchill's famous comment about being a rotten form of government, but the best we've got, makes sense to followers of Jesus like me, who have high hopes, but also know how corrupting power can be. Can religion help democratic societies? It's a slightly cautious, but generally hopeful yes from me. I think it can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lat, and thank you indeed to all of our panelists. I am thankful also to those who have already begun sending me questions and comments. Continue submitting your thoughts and questions as we go through the rest of our programme. And I will we'll get stuck into those shortly. Just before we do that, I would just like to quickly draw people's attention to a link that I've just posted in the chat, which is to a Google form, which will take you to an evaluation feedback survey, which I would just ask if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments to fill that in at some point this evening. Any feedback that you can offer is always very greatly appreciated. I'll also put that link again in the chat at the end of our meeting. In general, the questions that, or the responses that we've had to that prompt question, we're exploring this relationship between religion and democracy in general. But as I mentioned in the introduction, we are in the context of a general election in the UK. And Jessica, there was a question that we had earlier, which I might direct to you. The question was if, or probably when, the Labour Party comes into power in the UK, what changes do you think will take place? And maybe to provide a focus to that question, I'll ask you to think specifically about the impact that this change of government might have on democracy in the UK. What thoughts do you have on the policies that the Labour Party has set out? If you feel comfortable sharing those comments and thoughts.
So what impact will a let's assume Labour government coming in, next month have for democratic policies? I mean, so over the past couple of years, there have been some seriously restrictive laws which have been passed. So let's start with the gagging law, for example, which was back in 2014, but more recently there's been the policing bill, the police crime. Oh, I worked on it and I cannot remember the acronym, but it was to do with, there was a lot to do with protest there. What sort of things could you protest about? What could the government decide was a reasonable protest? How could it take place? There was an awful lot of power given to the police. There was a lot of power given to the Secretary of State to decide what was reasonable in those cases. Labour is very unlikely to restrict protest laws, which would be one of the major democratic things they could do. Labour has talked about how they would change voter ID. They would allow various forms of voter ID to be used, but they haven't said they're going to roll it back completely, at least not that I've heard. It might be that there's something I haven't seen that says they'll do that, but that's not something I have seen, which of course, that is a significant piece of legislation, which was very much a sledgehammer to crack a nut. That would make a huge change. They're not going to do it. They might give votes at 16, which the democracy sector, I think, would count as being low-hanging fruit. But that might happen over the next few years. They are not likely to change the voting system, unfortunately. I mean, there is a huge movement within the Labour Party to go to a proportional representation system, which might be single transferable vote rather than the first past the post that we have at the moment. That would have a remarkable impact. But there seems to be, that may or may not happen. So, fingers crossed, everyone, I would say on that one.
Thank you very much, Jessica. There was also a question that we had earlier around how the election and the election campaigns are affecting people personally. And I wonder, Farah, if you had any thoughts in response to that question. Is it affecting you, the experience of this election campaign? And if so, how?
So I think it's slightly different in the devolved nations because we do have more of a choice. Now, I'm very proud of the fact that I've actually never been binary in my approach to politics. So I think that the key factor in getting proportional representation is having the choice. And I don't mean proportional representation in the political sense. I mean that our elected government should be a really representative forum of the people. And so therefore, and we don't have that. We don't have that in terms of religion or ethnicity or gender or social-political backgrounds. We don't have that. So, in this particular election, I think I have really, really learned to appreciate the fact that I have more than a binary choice because I'm in one of the devolved nations. And I think the future of politics in this country will only be better if we do have, more of a European hung parliament situation where people feel empowered not just to vote, with their conscience, but also to vote in a way that really reflects what the changes they want. So I think that would probably be the main take home for this.
Thank you, Farah. Megan, there's a question which I may direct towards you because it touches on the question of secularism. You mentioned in your opening statement the example of the USA, and there was a question which asked, "Is religion, are religion and state separate in America? Is America an example that you would class of a secular society?" Some states in the USA, this commenter points out, have just mandated the Ten Commandments be prominently displayed in schools. Do you think there is a separation between church and state in America? And if so, is it working?
Well, that's a really good question. Obviously, America was founded on separation of church and state, that wall of separation, as Jefferson said. So it was originally founded on this idea, and it was founded by religious people wanting basically not wanting interference in the government and saying that these two spheres should be separate. So what's happening right now in America is deeply worrying. The recent law passed in Louisiana mandating the Ten Commandments is an example of how this is being eroded. This wall of separation is being eroded, very sadly. It's interesting to see that several human rights groups are going to be lodging a legal challenge against this. So the American Civil Liberties Union, Americans United for Separation of Church and State are going to fight this one. So it's not a done deal yet. It's had a massive backlash. Because for many Americans, this is their bread and butter. The idea that church and state, that religion and state are separate, is their bread and butter. So they have a very strong understanding of why this concept is important. There is a big difference between a secular state and a secular society. America is a good example of one where it's a very secular state in terms it has a secular constitution, which, as we see, it can still be vulnerable, but it's not a secular society. It's quite a religious one. And this is what Donald Trump is currently playing at, is that, in fact, religion is slightly on the wane. Christianity certainly is slightly on the wane in the USA. And in a way, I think Trump is playing with fears that particularly white evangelicals have about sort of the society changing to try and push through a more religious approach to his politics. So, yeah, it just goes to show that this wall between religion and state does need constant vigilant checks. Otherwise, you do see this kind of divisive politics that Trump promotes rear its head.
Thank you very much. Jessica, you also had some thoughts about the separation between religion and state, and specifically the difference between how that might work on paper versus in practice. I wonder if you would like to offer any thoughts on that question about the difference between separation of church and state in theory and in practice. And then I might go to Lat as well for some thoughts on that question.
So I think Megan summed up the separation between state and the church versus the separation between society and the church. I think that is a clear difference. Plus, it's also, that, when you talk about separation between state and religion, I think it matters whether we're talking about religion versus religions, because quite often this is founded upon, the idea that you can have multiple religions, not necessarily that there would be, so it wasn't one religion, which would be the key religion, rather than there would be no religion. Now, we can't go back to the founding of America and say, which precisely did you mean? But I think that it does actually matter, and we perhaps are living in a slightly different world to the one that the pioneers expected there. But the separation the separation in practice versus the separation in paper. I mean, technically, the UK, we have the head of the church. He is the head of state as well. There is one person who technically holds both roles. Now, of course, there are a lot of, backstops and, what about this? And, these duties are taken over by that, but we have a state religion. So on paper, we're a theocracy. So I think that there is a real difference here between how it works in practice and how it works in paper, because the Lord's Spirit shall exist, which indicates that we should be, there in that list with the Saudi Arabias of the world, but we're not. And I think it's because it's how we use what the paper says rather than, what the technical definitions are. Sorry, that was a bit waffly.
No, thank you very much. Lat, would you like to come in on this?
Not waffly at all, Jessica. Thank you. I'm a bit ignorant, okay? So I'm really pleased to see Christopher and Ronald's commentary from the USA on the questions that we're considering about Trump. And I would very much defer to them. That I don't know very many Christian people who are Donald Trump supporters, but clearly there's 70 million odd of them in the US. I think if you want to post the 10 Commandments in Louisiana schools, then you'd better feed the children decent school meals first. And I find the whole situation there, that should be a matter of intense legal dispute and enormous political energy. I find that a bit baffling. So that's quite an ignorant answer from me. Might have been waffly as well.
Not at all. What about I wonder if you have thoughts on the situation in the UK. The fact that in principle or in theory, we don't have a separation between church and state. But in practice, a couple of people have suggested religion actually plays less of a role in our politics than it does in some other countries. Would you agree with that? Do you feel that we do have a separation between church and state? And should we?
Well, I think that's really interesting. And I think, for instance, the secular model in the UK has arisen to some extent from a kind of residual religiosity running back 2-3 centuries, and Reformation, Church of England, theological streams and political influences have been in that. From my point of view, I think that's all residual, and I would like to see an end to that residual set of privileges that the Church of England continues to enjoy, and I'd like those privileges to be distributed evenly. I'm just always interested by the concept of this identity thing for me, but the concept of being a Christian socialist interests me a lot. And I kind of like it when people in public life, our politicians, are comfortable to identify themselves within their religious community, because I think that's actually a signal of mature democracy and a signal of a community willing to listen to each other. So people like Sadiq Khan or Wes Streeting or other members of, and that's my party, of course, other members of the government who identify religiously and have something positive to say about the way that religion influences their perspective and their engagements and their policies. I welcome that. I think that's a sign of mature democracy.
Okay, thank you very much. Farah, I'm going to turn to you. Firstly, if you have any opinions on this question of the so-called Lords Spiritual. So these are bishops of the Church of England who are entitled by virtue of being bishops of the Church of England to sit in the House of Lords. What is your perspective on that? Do you think that's valuable? Do you think it's problematic? And I'll give you a chance to comment on that issue.
I think it's a historical principle that has been there for a very long time. It has not been problematic up until now. In fact, they've been the vanguards of a lot of ethical, rulings within the House of Lords. And I'm really actually quite happy to see the voting nature of these particular members of the House of Lords. Because if you look in just the Rwanda flights, for instance, they were strictly opposed to them. They were opposed to limiting the ability of people to march against genocides. So actually they have shown themselves not to be partisan, but to go with their, the good faith of their belief system and push through ideas that hold our politicians to account. And as such, they're almost rooted more in the moral and ethical ideas rather than the political ideas, which can be be sort of floating on the top of waves and going up and down. They're sort of very much anchored on the sediment of what I think the principles of this country are built upon. So.
Thank you, Farah. While we have you, at the risk of appearing to stir up contention, when Megan read out in her opening statements the list of some of the least democratic countries in the world, I noted that many of the countries that were listed were Muslim majority countries, and I wondered if you felt that she was being selective in the list of least democratic countries that she read out, and if you had any thoughts or responses to that.
I don't think Megan was being selective, but I think the list is political and selective. I think much of the funding for the UN and UNRWA and all of these things is based on these kind of lists. I think, we can be a bit more sort of cynical about why these lists are made and what they're made for. We know for a fact that the least democratic, country in the world is North Korea. We know that. You know, even with the Taliban, they still have their, you know, show voting, elections and things like that. North Korea doesn't have any of that. And North Korea is actually so stringently secular, you know, that it's almost punishable by death to bring any other aspect into the political sphere. And yet it is not on that list, which is interesting. So, you know, it's whereas you look at Indonesia, you know, the most populous Muslim country. And again, and I know this because my cousin actually worked with the Carter Center, and she was an international monitor for elections all across the world. And they absolutely got the gold standard for how they conducted their elections. In fact, she bemoaned the fact, because she's American, she bemoaned the fact that that wasn't the case in America, because she was part of the Georgia legislature that took Trump's voting, issues to court, and they won, obviously. And so being an international monitor of these things, she was quite, outspoken about the fact that actually that the level of corruption and the lack of democratic transparency in America is eye-watering compared to what she saw in Indonesia. So I think we've got to be careful. I wouldn't blame Meghan. I think all of us are fed these parameters, and very few of us have the ability to sort of pick them apart. So that's what I would like to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Farah. Megan, I feel I should give you a chance to come in at this point if you'd like to.
Yeah, I'm really glad that Farah mentioned North Korea, because I think that is something we should absolutely address, is when you have a state that forbids all religion. I mean, with North Korea, they've sort of replaced religion with worship of the ruling Kim dynasty. That's precisely what secularism seeks to avoid, is that kind of situation as well. It's one where you basically say all religions and beliefs should have freedom, except where exercise that freedom will impinge on other people's freedoms and rights. And that's where you strike the balance, is you make sure that there is freedom of religion and belief for everyone, except where it's going to interfere with other rights. So North Korea is absolutely not the sort of state that we think is a good model of a secular democracy. And as we know, it is very much at the bottom, although I think Afghanistan weirdly outranked it in 2022. I haven't found a democracy index that's more up to date. So that's my remarks on North Korea. And with Indonesia, surely we can see that there are some severe problems with its democracy, its freedom of speech. It still has an awful lot of issues. So again, and it's one where I think potentially those issues are growing as well. And again, related to embracing radical Islam, of an Islam that is not tolerant of democracy and rights.
Okay, Farah, I saw that you had a hand raised. I'll go to you briefly, and then I'll go to Jessica after that.
Megan, just to say that actually freedom of religion is integral within North Korean governance. It's actually part of their remit. I don't know if that's the reality. I've never been, but in terms of what's protected within their government, it is one of the things they say they protect. So.
Can I come back on that?
Very quickly, yeah.
I mean, there's not. I mean, with North Korea, you can't believe anything that's maybe written up. And they're called the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. They're not. You can't. You have to look at what they're actually doing in practice and what people are thrown in jail for. And they are thrown. If you are not a member, it's like China. China's similar. You have to be a member of a church that is approved by the North Korean state. The churches have traditionally in North Korea been a place where if you are a defector, you flee to. But in fact, many defectors, once they set foot inside the church, they realise that it's actually one of these official ones that reports straight back to the administration, and then they're caught. So in fact, it is very much like China. It's in the same situation where the churches actually are acting as an arm of the state, and where they are approved. So where you have so you have to have, like, for example, the Catholic Church in China has to be very, very careful about what it says and does, because China tells it what to say and do.
Jessica, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this issue. Also, I noted in the meeting chat a couple of points you were making about the democracy index and how that works sort of methodologically. And I wondered if you would like to make any of those points.
That was really just the point I wanted to make, that when you're looking at a democracy index, and yes, it is useful. Statistics, can be very useful, but they cannot. But the statistics we choose can sometimes be misleading, and it's not necessarily deliberately misleading, but it's looking at something and saying, well, this is obviously going to be given slightly more weight than this. We all come with biases where we say, oh, well, this is more important than this. This is the thing that should fit first. Democracy indexes, and there are a couple, of different types, but the main one seems to my mind, at least, and this could just be a personal opinion, seems to favor free elections rather than necessarily fair elections. So they put very little weight upon the precise voting method, but they put a lot of weight upon the fairness of an election, the freeness of the election, so how free people are to vote. And going around, looking through the polling stations for the UK. I have not done this abroad, but I have done this with the UK. I've sort of, I have monitored the local elections, and I've monitored the European elections here. Certainly, we have an election where you can, wander up and vote on the day very freely. But there's still an awful lot of, there's a lot of paperwork involved. There's a lot of ways in which you can nudge the result of an election, not by stealing the election, but by minor suppression techniques, like voter ID, for example. So I would just be pointing out that the democracy index can sometimes include some rather Western biases about what makes a good thing for democracy, rather than saying this is bad or this is good.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jessica. Lat, I haven't heard from you for a while, so I will turn to you. Firstly, if you have any thoughts or comments that you'd like to make on the discussion that we've had just recently on kind of measuring and assessing how democratic countries are. And then I also have a slightly different question for you afterwards. But firstly, if you do have anything you'd like to say in response to that, feel free to share it.
Oh, well, so just a first thought about that, and I'm not expert in this field in the same way that some of our other panelists are, but I like the idea of democracy increasing its spread and being increasingly found among grassroots communities. So the measure to introduce 16 to 18-year-old votes in England and across the UK, we already have that in Scotland, is very welcome from my point of view. I like democratic institutions in schools, actually, and I think that growing grassroots democracy is something that I see a straight line from my own religious convictions to. So where schools have, British schools might have a schools council, and children, young people get experience of the democratic process, but also some democratic power in that. That's a bit different. I know nothing of the technicalities of monitoring North Korean elections, although the picture doesn't look good. What was your other question?
So my other question, there's been some interesting comments and discussion I've noticed in the chat around comparing religion and politics. So sort of just as phenomena, religious belief and political ideology. And I wonder whether you think that certain political ideologies should be classed as kinds of religion, or is there something sort of fundamentally distinct about religious beliefs and political beliefs?
Okay. PhD to be acquired by somebody who can answer that question properly. I'll give you two things about it from my point of view. The first is that within the academic disciplines of religious study, the question of the definition of religion is forever disputed and extremely tricksy. So whether way of the Buddha is to be called a religion is a very lively question. But also from within the different religious communities that it's my pleasure and privilege to work with, I hear people who say, oh, I'm not religious, I'm a Christian. I'm not religious, I'm a seriously committed Muslim. I'm not religious, and that happens everywhere, because the rejection of the category of religiosity by some insiders there, that's a common phenomenon. And I think it reflects the complexity and difficulty of the accounts we give of religious identities and belonging in our discourse. The other thing I'd say there, though, I'm really disturbed as the UK approaches its election by people who say, politics, it's all the same. And I'm trying to fight that. I'm trying to stand against that in every argument and conversation that I possibly can. Politicians are not all the same. Somebody said to me just this week, politicians are the worst evil in the world. I said, well, come on, Nelson Mandela was a politician. And do you think he's part of that? And I detest the way in which all the same is a label given to politicians. Notice the same thing happens sometimes from non-religious perspectives, that religions are described as all the same. And I think that a more careful look, a more nuanced look at the definitions of what we mean by political ideology and the definitions of what we mean by religion, and the proper thoughtful investigation of how those are manifested in practice is important. That leads me to think it's a statement of the obvious in some ways, that within every religion, one finds one's radicals and conservatives, one's traditionalists and one's progressives, one finds one's fundamentalists and repressives, as well as one's liberationists. So the big question for me there is, what's happening inside religions? That means that a religion can contain a debate between all of those different kind of ways of being Christian or Hindu or Jewish.
Thank you very much. Jessica, I've noticed quite a bit of a theme emerging within the chat around the character of politicians, particularly Donald Trump has been mentioned a lot in comments that I've seen. And I was wondering, from your perspective, how important is personal character in elected officials? How important is that for safeguarding a healthy democracy?
So this is actually a really difficult one, because the vast majority of people who I speak to in politics, who have spoken to in politics, think they are doing the right thing. There is nobody I have ever met who I've thought, oh yes, they've gone into politics in order to do something completely wrong. They know this is a path that is not not supposed to be trodden. Now, I haven't met Donald Trump, and I haven't met Nigel Farage, and I haven't met a whole load of other people. But the people I have met, some of them do think, oh, well, this is a means to an end, but the ends will make it worth it. I mean, people have different approaches. Normal people in normal life have different approaches. Some people focus, more upon the short term. Some people focus more upon the long term. Some people think that the means really matter. Some think that the end result, will justify the way that you get there. And politicians, they are human beings, but they often live in a bubble where they talk to each other and they get sucked into the way that things have always been done, and so this sort of systemic, they become more institutionalized within parliament, within local government, and then they pop out the other end and they go, oh, that seemed really clear in there that was the only way. Maybe it's not the only way, which is why they appear so statesmanlike afterwards. And I'm not convinced that character is necessarily the way to approach that, because that implies that there are some people who are strong enough to resist a lure or something, which I don't think is quite it. It's just that people have different approaches. Some people think that big business has the answer because the market has the answer. Some people think that the church has the answer because that's what they grew up with, or that's their community. Some people think that citizens' assemblies are the answer. So I think it's just that we need to make sure that we pierce the bubble rather than that we elect people of character, because electing people of character is not really a thing that actually makes any sense. Getting through to them once they're there, that's what we need to do.
Okay, thank you. Farah, along a similar line to the question that I asked Lat about the relationship between has Farah dropped off? Farah, are you? Oh no, you're
Yeah,
there. Sorry, you disappeared from my screen for some reason. There we go. I can see you. This question of the relationship between political ideology and religious belief. Somebody made the point in the question in the chat. We often appeal to should or ought to, and these are appeals to an external system of values when we're forming political opinions. Is this essentially a religious question, these questions of values, even if they're not acknowledged as such? Can we separate political values and religious values?
There can be a religious question if that's your motivation. However, it doesn't have to be. I don't think that you're restricted in any way by having that belief system or not having it, as long as all of you are, working for the common good. I actually had the honor of being in a meeting with Brendan Cox this week. I don't know if many of you know Joe Cox, who was killed by someone who took deep, umbrage at what she was saying and what she was promoting. And Joe Cox came from a religious background, but she didn't. That's not what she stood up for. That she wasn't approaching things because of her religion. But then it didn't hinder her either. I mean, she was such a principled person and a champion of other people and their religious identity. And yet it's not what she came from. And so, like I said, there's a commonality looking for a greater good. And going back to this idea of, just politicians being inherently good or inherently bad. They're up against a very difficult thing. It's getting more and more dangerous, I think, to be a politician, and it's getting more polarized. And I think sometimes when you come from a faith community, you have that backing that, there's something telling you that this is a right principle, rather than wondering whether this is worth, sticking your neck out for. So you have some kind of, groundswell of approval or support, in a way that maybe you don't if you're just coming from a purely external source. So I don't know if that sometimes can be an imperative, but it's not. It's it's not binary. Things aren't binary. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Lat, there's some discussion in the chat around the impact that politicians being open about their faith can have on their electoral chances, their chances of being elected. Some people have been contrasting the US and the UK. The perception in the US, perhaps, that the personal faith of politicians can help them to get elected, and perhaps in the UK it has an opposite effect. I'm wondering what your perspective is on that. Does being a prominent Christian or being prominent in one's faith hurt the electoral chances of politicians, and is that a problem for democracy?
A really interesting question. I know what my aspiration would be there, that a more honest and transparent democracy would mean that people who stand for office would be able to say something personal and clear about their identity in religious or non-religious terms, and it to be received as what it is, a statement of identity. I think that the British case is intriguing there. So Ruth Davidson, a Conservative leadership candidate in the Conservative Party in Scotland, and Tim Farron, a Liberal Democrat leader for a short time in the UK. Those would be examples of people who found their religious convictions led to considerable conflict once they'd assumed significant roles within their political parties. As I've suggested, I think you have to nod to God in the USA if you're going to have any chance of getting on the ballot paper. And again, I don't claim to understand that, not a US citizen or lived in the US. Take two other examples, though. Take the case of India at the moment, where the form of secularism in India is under great pressure from Narendra Modi's leadership. But then it's interesting, he's won twice, and then the recent election, he still got a lot of votes, but I don't think he can say he won the third time. So the Indian form of secular in democracy is doing a job there, I think, to perhaps restrict the majoritarianism of the overwhelming Hindu majorities in the electorate. Take another example from Ireland. That one interests me because I think that has changed quite sharply. I think if I go back a generation, then religiosity might have been an electoral plus, but I think it's become a neutral or negative in the ways that people stand and present themselves to electorates. Like I say, my ideal there would be an honest, transparent democracy in which Neil Kinnock telling us he's an atheist or Tony Blair saying he's a Christian would be a part of the fleshing out of who they are that electorates do deserve to know about.
Thank you very much. Megan, I'll give you a chance as well to respond on that theme. Do you think it's important for democracy for politicians to be able to be open about their faith without it harming or affecting their electoral chances?
Well, in a way, they are forced to be a bit open about their faith, because when new members of parliament are sworn in, they can choose to either take a religious oath on a holy book or to take a secular affirmation. And it's interesting that we are a country now that's more religiously diverse than ever and is increasingly irreligious. So Wales and Scotland, as we know from the census, the majority are now non-religious. And in England, it's the second largest group. Christians are now a minority. And yet, the last time in 2019, when parliamentarians were sworn in, most of them swore the oath to Almighty God, which either so that there were very few that affirmed. And affirmation doesn't necessarily mean they're non-religious. Many affirmed because that's what they say. Many the Quakers affirm. Actually, Fiona Bruce affirms as well because she's an evangelical Christian, and some evangelical Christians believe you can't take a religious oath on a Bible and you can't swear an oath to God. So, but it's interesting that even though we're an increasingly irreligious country, most parliamentarians are swearing on the King James Bible to Almighty God. So either that means they think that they feel they have to because it's tradition, so they're not willing to do the secular one because they feel that eyes are on them and they have to do it that way, or they're not sure about the whole thing. They're just confused by the whole thing. Or they are genuinely Christian, in which case it's interesting that Parliament is weighted more towards religion than the general public is. In fact, we think that is the case. We think that parliamentarians are more likely to be actively religious than the general public are. So that does raise some questions. Is it the case that if you are a member of a minority religion, or if you're not religious, there is this feeling that you can't actually be that open about it, that you have to... that somehow declaring that you're non-religious, people think that you're somehow being hostile to religion if you do that. So I think that there is that question there.
Thank you very much. Jessica, there was a question or a comment rather in the chat that I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on, suggesting that democracy can be divisive, that the effort to get over that sort of 50% mark to get your idea in the majority encourages or can be divisive. I wanted to get your opinion. Do you agree that democracy is divisive or can be divisive? Is that a problem? And if so, how can we make it less divisive?
Yes, of course it's divisive. It depends what you mean by democracy. And the thing that gave it away was the getting over the 50% mark. Now, the parliamentary chamber, the parliamentary chamber in Westminster, that is a certain distance from bench to bench, because that is a sword's width. So it is designed so that you cannot whip out your sword to kill your opponent. It is too far away. But it's in rows because they first sat. So when you come into Parliament, you come in through Westminster Hall, which is where Henry VIII used to play tennis, and there are some shuttlecocks, I think, somewhere still up in the rafters, or were found there recently. You then come into a sort of, there are some big steps. You go up and you turn right, and that is St Stephen's Chapel. Well, that is the basis for St Stephen's Chapel, which was one of the first places that they sat. Now, it's been a while since I did the tour of Parliament, and at one point I was able to lead the tours myself, and I've forgotten most of the facts there, but I'm pretty certain that that section there was where one of the first parliaments was held, and then they moved later to the two chambers. There were various burnings down and everything, and various things were rebuilt. But the way that it is set up, basically, was set up in violence. It was set up to prevent the violence becoming worse. So to keep it at merely divisive debates which involved shouting at each other rather than actually murdering each other. So the simple question of whether democracy is divisive, yes, it's very divisive, and it has kind of been designed that way, or that is the kind of democracy we have, because we use the system where somebody suggests a motion, they put down something and they say, this is a thing we want to be done. Then somebody else has to say yes or no. And they have to say, okay, we'd like to amend it in these ways. You go down the list of amendments, then you go back up, and then you say, right, we've made various amendments, yes or no answers. It's all been decided right here on the floor. Will we agree the whole thing? Yeah, there are various stages. You send it away for committee, it comes back. But what is decided there on the floor has to be a binary answer, rather than something where it is a willia coming together. Not only that, but you have to know what you're submitting in advance. You can't just stand up and say, there's actually this new information. Can we do this third way? There's essentially no mechanism by which a compromise third way option can arise from the floor during that debate. You have to go away and find an amendment which changes such and such, and bring it back and vote on it, and it has to be a binary answer, which makes it very difficult, and it makes it necessarily divisive. This is why there are various committees there. This is why they've added in the stages, in order to try to balance that out. Does that answer all the questions? I've lost track slightly of what precisely they were.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. Lat, I'll give you a chance as well to respond to that question about whether democracy is divisive. And I'll also read out a comment on that question. We've spoken a lot about division. However, also, what about the ability for religious communities to work together, where there are uniting issues, for example, climate change action? Can the power of religion be a force for good within democracy?
Oh, thank you. I'll tackle that with reference to the climate crisis. Bill McKibben, brilliant genius of climate activism, says everybody's got to play their best game for the next 10 years if we're going to have a chance to hit the climate goal. That means everybody from every religion, as well as everybody from any political perspective or ideology. And actually, like the idea there, that the best game from religions involves working together. The best game for climate justice action involves taking serious action through all of the institutions that we have, if that be Christian Aid or Islamic Relief, the major international NGOs that work for that work for poverty reduction in the face of climate injustice. That working together is essential. And where I see it, I rather like it. I think it's rather impressive. It's still the case that religions command intense and deep loyalties, and the intense, deep loyalties that they command can be channeled to what, from my perspective, are the values of compassion, the values of justice. So that's an answer that includes the question about divisiveness, because actually I don't think compromise is a dirty word in politics. I think compromise is an essential. That's one reason why first past the post systems are difficult, because they don't impose structural compromise on multi-party working. The German model is interesting there, isn't it? That coalition is the normal practice of German governance in democracy. I'm sure in the US and perhaps in the UK, I'm sure there's something that we could learn from that.
Thank you very much. Time is pressing on, and I would like to make sure that I give all of our panelists a chance to share some closing thoughts and closing reflections. So I think I'll do that by working in the reverse of the order that we started with. So Lat, even though you've just spoken, if you have any closing thoughts, reflections, comments, or any points that you'd like to make that you feel that you haven't had a chance to, I'll give you a couple of minutes now to share some closing reflections with us.
Oh, goodness me. Well, thank you. Fantastic, really interesting and provocative discussion. I've enjoyed it enormously. I'll ask for your indulgence to make two kind of theological points. So the first one of those is about the way in which democracy, I think, needs a category called prophecy. Within different religious traditions, in Islamic Risala and in Jewish tradition, from which Christianity borrows very heavily, in my own Christian tradition, what do prophets do? They stand on the edge of society and they have a shout about what's wrong and how it could be put right. And they might do that in the name of a big figure, a God figure, but they might do it in the name of a big idea, the idea of justice, or the idea of equality, or the idea of liberty. And I think democratic structures and institutions are wonderful things, and I long to see their spread across more than 100 nations on Earth. I long to see their spread to North Korea and China, and increasingly actually to England and to the UK as well. Democratic structures are great, but actually I think that they also need prophetic voices from the margins. Those prophetic voices, they go with the dictum of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who is marching out of step, they're listening to a different drum. And sometimes I think that the drum of faith offers that different drum and offers people the chance to make a prophetic vision clear to a community, to a society that goes in some ways beyond democracy. I know that that's got lots of dangers attached to it, and my own scriptures are full of false prophets. Well, there's a theological kind of point. The other one is actually, what's the purpose of democracy? I think it is to create societies and communities in which the love of neighbour can flourish alongside the love of our own immediate families and concerns. And the idea was mentioned earlier, the idea of the common good. I think that's an idea that our politics desperately needs to refresh and to pick up and to renew. And I think that sometimes that idea of neighbour love, or the common good, or a purpose of democracy that is bigger than just counting the votes, I'd like to end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lat. Megan, any closing thoughts or reflections from you?
Oh, thank you. That was a really fascinating debate, and I think it was great to see so much agreement among people, despite coming from quite different angles a lot of the time, very different experiences, backgrounds. There's a lot of agreement on democracy being a good thing, and sort of religion being a bit of a mixed bag sometimes when it comes to democracy. So, just to close, I hope that you can see that secularism is not an anti-religious principle. It is, I believe, the only principle that can guarantee the rights and freedoms of people of all religions and beliefs. And that's because it ensures no religion can exert undue influence in politics. And I hope, too, that you can see that the lack of separation between church and state is holding the UK back from being a truly modern democracy. We are among a minority of countries which have a state religion, the Church of England, which inherently favours Anglicans, who are now a minority in the UK. Just 1% of people in England attend regular C.of.E. church services, according to the Church of England's own figures. And as we've mentioned, as a result of the C.of.E.'s established status, 26 bishops sit in the House of Lords as of right. Only one other sovereign nation has religious clerics in its legislature, and that's Iran. The bishops can and do vote like any other members of the Lords, and their votes tend to serve the agenda of the Church of England much of the time. And also stemming from the Church's established status are the daily prayers, which are imposed in Parliament and all parliamentarians, regardless of whether or not they have a religion or whether they're Anglicans. The daily Christian worship is also imposed on all state schools and in many councils across the UK. And the Church is also keen to maintain our system of faith schools, whereby a third of our state-funded schools are controlled by religious organisations who are all aimed to keep their numbers up by making sure children are inculcated into that religion. As I mentioned, the UK is now more diverse than ever, and it's increasingly irreligious. And I think in this system, our democracy will grow increasingly fragile if the ties between religion and state are maintained. Already we can see bitter division and disputes between different religious communities. And I think this will deepen if our school system in particular continues to segregate children according to religion, and the presence of the state church continues to perpetuate inequality and elitism. Secularism, separation of church and state, is the only way we can truly achieve a democracy which works for everyone, whatever their religion or belief.
Thank you, Megan. Farah, any closing thoughts, comments, or reflections from you?
Well, everyone spoke so eloquently. I feel there's not much to add. I think I agreed with almost everything Lat had to say, to be honest. But I do feel that whatever belief system you come from, or whether you come from none, the principle of humanity, of looking out for one another, of trying to establish, you know, the right over wrong, is what should drive us. And if there's anything that stops our representatives falling prey to their egos, it should be something that, you know, we should foster, whether it be religion, whether it be ethos, whatever it would be. And I think everything is corruptible. There is nothing that is beyond that, but it's, you know, behoves every one of us to hold to account the people that we put in those positions, and particularly if they come from our own faith backgrounds, because we are meant to be reminders to them of what they owe us. So I think that's what I would say.
Thank you, Farah. And Jessica, I'll give the last word to you from our panelists.
Thank you. The last word, eh? So firstly, thanks to everyone else. My quibbles with Megan would be very minor indeed, and on sort of minor points of detail. And I think that most of the panelists have said very similar things. And I think actually, look, we are, there is much more we agree on, than disagree on, much more. So I think the last word would probably be that democracy doesn't mean just Westminster or just elections. People often think about democracy and they think, okay, we're sending these members of parliament off to Westminster and that's it. And that's not it at all. There's far more to democracy and there's far more to democratic processes. But I'd also say that faith is much more than a set of rules, which you carry out, going to, the church, the temple, the mosque. Faith is a far greater thing, which is part of our messy human lives. So I think those are probably the two things to leave you with.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and indeed, thank you to all of our panelists. This has been for me, a very enjoyable discussion of a big and difficult topic. I'd like to thank everybody who's participated, especially our panelists, but also anybody who has asked questions, left comments, or simply turned up and listened. If I could just remind everyone again to please fill in the form. I have just put the link into the chat again. So that is an evaluation feedback survey. We really welcome constructive feedback and insight into what people are interested in and how we can improve the format for future discussions. If you'd like to be kept in the loop for future events like this, please consider either leaving your email address in the chat, or if you prefer to do that privately, there's also an option to leave your email address on the evaluation form. And then you can be added to our mailing list and receive details of future events. Another way to be kept updated with details of our future discussions is to like and follow our Facebook page, which is called Belief in Dialogue, and I will post a link to that in the chat as well. Our next forum will be on the 16th of February 2025, which will be on the topic of God, evil and suffering. And we hope that you will join us then. So that brings us actually in very good time and ahead of my expectations to the end of the official programme. If you need to rush off, then please feel free to leave the meeting and enjoy the rest of your evening. Otherwise, if anyone would like to stay in the meeting for a little longer for some informal conversation, then you're very welcome to. I will hang around in the meeting for a little while. Maybe some of our panelists might want to as well, depending on their schedule and commitments. So thank you again to everyone for coming. I hope to see some of you at our next Interfaith Forum, and have a wonderful week.